بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. حياكم الله وبياكم في قسم علوم البحار للمحاضرة الشيقة بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى مع الدكتور الزائر لقسم علوم البحار الدكتور جون لارجيير. Did I pronounce it correctly, Doctor? Yes, okay. So Dr. John, he's from University of California, Davis. He did his bachelor's degree in University of Cape Town in applied mathematics. Also, he did his this is another honored bachelor's degree in Cape Town again in applied mathematics, and his PhD in oceanography in University of Cape Town in '87. So Dr. John seeks to understand environmental issue through application of principles, analysis, and insights derived from oceanography. His work is deeply interdisciplinary, working with experts in ecology, policy, health, social science, engineering, and other fields. Developing an environmental oceanography paradigm centered on water include marine protected areas, fisheries, aquaculture, beach pollution, wastewater discharge, wildlife health, desalination, stormwater pollution, coastal power plant, kelp forest loss, wetland health, marine mining, and coastal development. In addition to advising numerous states and federal agencies in the United States of America and South Africa, he has published over 200 papers, book chapters. Currently, he's a distinguished professor in environmental science and policy and a director of the Bodega Marine Laboratory at UC Davis. Prior to 2004, he was at UC San Diego Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the University of Cape Town, and CSIR in South Africa. So we are very honored at the Marine Science Department to have Dr. John with us today, and he will take us with a wonderful journey through the thermal buoyancy, forcing, and we should have fun today.
Salam. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for that introduction. I wrote too many words. It went on too long. Can you hear me all right? Yes. And if I walk away, can you hear me still? Yes. Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in Kuwait and at the university. And I'm going to give a short talk about some work that I've been doing over quite a long time, I suppose. And recently I wrote a review paper called Low Inflow Estuaries, because there are a lot of environments like Kuwait Bay which are really, to my mind, they are estuaries. But in the world of our literature, a lot of it comes from Western Europe and the Northeast United States, where there's always water running down the rivers into the sea, and it's not like that everywhere. So for a long time, those of us from South Africa, or Chile, or Mexico, or whatever, felt like, oh, ours are not really estuaries. I think they are. They're a different paradigm of estuary. And then from that, I lead into the importance of thermal buoyancy forcing, not just the freshwater forcing, and talk a bit about the shallow coastal waters, hoping to lead into discussion about Kuwait Bay and also about the nearshore coastline here in southern Kuwait. So traditionally, estuaries are where the river meets the sea. Here's a picture from a textbook with the freshwater coming in from the river over on top, and then the seawater getting pulled in, mixing up, and then going out at the top. So you have a vertical circulation, like a conveyor belt. Typically the estuary has a wide open mouth and there's always a river flowing. There's no dry season. And then the understanding of the ecology or the biogeochemistry of an estuary is that it's always driven by the river. What is in that watershed? What nutrients, what pollutants, what organic material, and that's the understanding of the estuary ecosystem. Of course, I'm making very sweeping comments because if you speak to the researchers, they'll say, no, we don't think that. But at the same time, when you read the textbook, that's the story you get. So if you look at a place like Kuwait Bay and many other estuaries, you see similar habitats in salt marshes and shallow shoals. You see similar productivity. And a lot of these places are where a river, maybe we started calling a watercourse because there's not always water in the river. Sometimes it's dry, sometimes it's flowing, where they meet the sea, but there's not a persistent freshwater inflow. So I think we have to recognize these as estuaries as well, but it's a paradigm, it's a little different to the classical textbook one. And there are many of them. They're quite diverse in their form. Often we call them a lagoon or a bay or a gulf or something, but they're all over the world. So I want to recognize that in arid regions, but also actually in mountainous regions where there's small watershed, that we have these low inflow estuaries. So it's common. In that paper, I tried to look at the literature, and too many people are writing too many papers, so I can't say I looked at everything. But in these places where I have red dots, there are some reports. So up in California, there are quite a few of them in Baja, Mexico, mainland Mexico, down here, Costa Rica, Honduras, and Peru, Chile, southern Argentina. The map underneath this is a rainfall map or precipitation map. So the yellow, green areas are where it's not much rainfall. There's Atacama Desert. Here's the dry part of southern Argentina. Actually, in northern Brazil is quite dry. The systems there. Of course, in South Africa, the south coast, there are a lot of them. Up into Namibia, and Senegal, all around the Mediterranean Sea. I should have put Kuwait Bay there probably, but I didn't. But even right up in Crimea, you know, and in India and Australia, all over the place. There are estuaries which are not always, they're not always low salinity, let's put it that way. So that's the one place where you find these. So now I have two maps. The left one is rainfall and the right one is evaporation. Because the water comes in from the river. If you have precipitation in the watershed, of course fresh water comes in, but then evaporation takes it out. So the places where you would have a net positive input of fresh water will be the wet areas, the blue areas, and where you have a net loss of fresh water, the evaporation is bigger than the inflow. So you can see the areas, and they're similar, right? The areas with high evaporation are also places where there's low precipitation. Not perfectly, but quite similar. The other are, this is not such a good map, the regions where it's brown is where there's sort of mountainous coastline. So all along the west coast of South America, Mexico, California, a lot of South Africa, some parts of Australia, New Zealand, parts of India, here in the Red Sea, etc. If you've got a mountainous coast, then you've got a small watershed. If you have a small watershed, even when it rains, the river will flow maybe for a couple of weeks and then it stops. So the small watershed means that you have a short-tailed hydrograph, I guess you call it. So if it stops raining for 1 month, the river stops flowing. And then you'll end up with a low inflow estuary for maybe just some weeks, and then it rains again and the river flows again. So instead of being seasonally with a river and without a river, it's now maybe sometimes just for a few weeks or a month or something with and without a river. And then the other areas where it can be dry for years at a time, and then it'll be wet for a year and it'll be dry for years at a time. So the different time scales in which these fluctuate from being if you want to call it a classical estuary and a low inflow estuary. So in low inflow estuary regions, there are really two types of estuary developed. The one are those which are open to the sea, and the sea then is actively forcing the estuary without the river. I have a picture there of Tamales Bay, which is right next to our lab, and I do quite a lot of work. It's actually a tectonic system, so it's the San Andreas Fault. It's about 20 kilometers long, only 1 or 2 kilometers wide, and it's a beautiful place to be. And in summertime, the rivers are small because it's mountainous and it's dry, and that estuary goes hypersaline at a latitude of 38 degrees latitude, so it's not a desert region at all. And then the other is a picture of Saldanha Bay in South Africa. The other thing that happens where there are waves is that the mouth of the estuary closes. So you, in the Gulf, probably you don't see as much of this as you will on the open coast of South Africa, Australia, with the big Southern Ocean swell, but also California, Chile, and so on. So here's an estuary, or marsh, coastal wetland, if you like. But look at this. Well, now there's a road, okay, but there was a sand spit, closes it entirely. It still makes a little mouth underneath the bridge there. Well, here's the Russian River. This is in San Diego, in Southern California. This is in Northern California. A little bit more natural. There's the beach wants to close it off. The waves want to close it off. I'm not going to talk about this one so much. It's very interesting, but in quite a different way. So I'm going to talk about the open mouth situation. So if you have evaporation exceeding river inflow, then you will slowly lose fresh water from the estuary, and it'll get saltier and saltier. The whole Gulf is a hypersaline estuary, really. It's more salty than the Indian Ocean. This is a river in Senegal, the Saloum, and sometimes the river flows quite strongly and the salinity is less than the ocean, but during periods when the river is not flowing, then you see this from the mouth here going up 200 kilometers. It's actually a long, thin river. We can talk about that a bit more later, but you see the salinity at the ocean is maybe, 35 or 36 or something, and then it increases almost exponentially up to a maximum, and it drops down because there's still a little river coming in here. The river comes in, but then it evaporates over maybe the first 50 kilometers. And so you get a maximum when it's dry, the maximum goes higher and also goes closer to the river. So we actually see the exact same pattern in that bay, Tamales Bay, where I study, but the salinity doesn't go to, 100, it only goes to 36 maybe. The ocean of California is about 34, and then the salinity only goes up maybe to 36. But in a place like the Saloum River, it's longer, it's more evaporative, and you can get quite high salinities. So that's cool. That's a hypersaline estuary, which is not the same as an inverse estuary. And so we have to recognize that density is what makes the circulation work. Dense water will go under less dense water, but density depends on salinity and temperature. Everybody knows that, right? And so if you got, and it's not the temperature or the salinity that makes that estuarine exchange flow, that vertical circulation, it's the density. So I made this little diagram for a book chapter some years ago, where on this axis I've got the change in salinity between the ocean and the estuary, and this would be 0, and this would be the delta S is less than 0, so I'll call it hyposaline. Basically, that the hypo means less, that the salinity in the estuary is less than the ocean, which would be a classical estuary. On this side is hypersaline. The salinity is greater than the ocean. Delta S is greater than 0, so that's a hypersaline estuary. But then at the same time, I do it here, with the temperature is the same in the estuary and the ocean. And over here, the temperature is greater, so if you like a hyperthermal, I mean, too many words, right? But it's a warm estuary, and a hypothermal, it's a cold estuary. And then if you look at the density line, though, it doesn't follow salinity exactly. It would follow this curve here. So all this situation, you have an estuary that is less dense, like a classical estuary, and then above that, the estuary is more dense. It's an inverse estuary. So we talk about a hypersaline estuary, but it's not going to be inverse unless it's above that line. So this region here, you'll have an estuary that's hypersaline, but it will still be so-called classical in the density forcing. And over here you'll have a estuary be lower salinity than the ocean, but it's going to be inverse because the estuary is cold. So there's a lot of this what I call a thermal estuary, where the circulation is being driven by temperature difference when you don't have very strong river flow. And there are examples of a hypothermal estuary where the estuary is cold and drains out, and probably, I would guess that at times Kuwait Bay in the middle of winter when you get the Shamal coming down really cold, that happens. But I'm not sure, maybe there are data, but maybe it'd be worth looking at. But what we see in upwelling areas, because the ocean is cold, we see that hyperthermal estuary, we see a lot of this. So Tomales Bay, I was saying it's hypersaline, but it's not inverse because the water is so warm compared to the ocean. So that's the idea of the thermal estuary. And here are some data from Tomales Bay. I'm not sure if you can see the photograph very well. Well, let's look at that graph first of all. So this is a period of time in 1993, 13, 14, 15, so what is this, 10 days or something. These are temperatures. This is the temperature near the mouth of the bay, where it's cold at high tide because you're bringing cold ocean water in, warm at low tide, and cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm. But you see that the high tide cold water drops down a little bit every now and then, and particularly here, dropping down to about 10 degrees, I think, because that's 10 degrees centigrade. You don't want to go swimming in California, not in Northern California too much. So there's been upwelling in the ocean. The water drops down to 10 degrees and incoming tide. And then this blue line and the magenta or purple line are at 8 kilometers and 12 kilometers into the bay. And the bay is 20 kilometers long. And you'll see they vary a little bit. But after the cold water appears at the mouth, you see the cold water appear about a day later at 8 kilometers and about another day later at 12 kilometers. So the cold water is intruding as like typically would be a salt wedge, but now it's a cold water wedge into the bay. These other ones are surface temperatures, and what's interesting is actually they go up because you're heating the surface layer. Main point being is you get this wedge of cold water going at least 2/3 of the way into the bay, and that cold water is full of nitrate, and it's probably full of larvae from the ocean, and it's at times hypoxic water because the upwelled water can be hypoxic. And so we see not only that it's intruding into the bay, but it's bringing a lot of material then. It's presumably important to the bay. Then the photograph is showing it's at about a position about 6 kilometers into the bay. This water up here is ocean water, cold, and this point here is a tidal intrusion front, where the cold water is going underneath the warm water and creating a foam line, just like you would see in a salinity situation. So that's what I mean by a thermal estuary. They're quite common in upwelling regions. We've seen this process happening in a few places, San Diego Bay, Saldana Bay, and bays in Chile as well. And so what is interesting then is also thinking about the temperature and salinity interplay, that doesn't happen at the same time. Things warm up, and what I write here, seasonal cycle in the warming and the seasonal cycle in the rain runoff evaporation are not completely matched. So this is a situation in Mission Bay in San Diego from essentially January to December, and you see the temperatures increase in summertime, and the inner bay is this dark line, warmer than the ocean, and the salinity is low, well not so low, but a little bit low in wintertime, and then it increases in summertime, and it's hypersaline. The salinity is higher than the ocean, warmer than the ocean. So when you look at density, the inner part of the estuary or bay becomes more dense, but it's still less dense than the ocean. So again, the thermal estuary idea. It's hypersaline, but the density difference is due to the temperature. But then you get to the later summer, and things start cooling down a little bit. And the inner bay cools down, and you get this point, although it's cooling, it's still more saline than the ocean. So at this point where we have the yellow circle, you'll see that suddenly changes to an inverse estuary for about a month. And then it ends when it rained in the winter time. So Mission Bay in San Diego it's a thermal estuary most of the time, thermal hypersaline, but then there's about a month in maybe like November or something like that where it becomes inverse. And we're looking for is there inverse circulation. So this is just another way of looking at the same picture. This is that diagram I had earlier. And so you start in winter, you go through summer, you come to the fall. So you have winter where it's a classical hyposaline, and then as you go through the spring, the estuary warms up and becomes more hypersaline, but it's a thermal estuary, which is most of the time. And then when it cools down, it becomes hypothermal, and then it rains, and so it kind of follows a cycle through this space. And that's probably what's happening in a lot of the upwelling system estuaries. Very different to here, because there the ocean is cold, and here the ocean, the Gulf, is warm. So you're not going to have the same cycle. You're going to more just shift left, right, I think. Not only is there a seasonal structure, but there's a longitudinal structure. So I drew this picture for based on what we see in Tomales Bay, but it could be for other places as well. So if this is the ocean right out here, and then 20 kilometers along to the back of Tomales Bay, first of all, we can look at the salinity. This green line is like a Tulum River in Senegal. It's not changing much, and then it starts going up exponentially. It's at maximum and then comes down because there's still a little river here. And it doesn't change much because it takes you have to keep the water in the bay for quite a long time before it loses enough fresh water to become hypersaline. But in Tomales Bay and upwelling regions, the water starts off quite cool. This is the orange line in the ocean, and warms up quite quickly. So the residence time out here is like one tidal cycle. Over here it's maybe 2 or 3 days. Maybe here it's getting to 10 days. And at the bay, the tidal currents are pretty weak, and the residence time can be months even. So it warms up quickly, and then it gets saturated, doesn't get any warmer as the water gets older, but the salinity gets higher. So now we go to the purple line, which is density. It starts off at a certain value and becomes less dense because it's getting warmer, and then it doesn't get any less dense, and then starts getting more dense because it's becoming hypersaline, and it becomes less dense as it's becoming more riverine. So we actually see a density maximum, this road X, and a density minimum. It's a little theoretical maybe. We do see the structure, but is it important? That's something we're still trying to explore really. Where do we see this being shown to be important? But there are some papers, Erica Wolanski wrote about an estuary in Australia. He called it the salt plug. So if you look at the density here, this is like a classical estuary, right? Drop. So you should have the fresh water coming out and the seawater coming in. So there's a circulation like that. But this is an inverse estuary here. So you should have the salty water going out and the less salty water coming in. So you've got these two counter-rotating cells, and he says, well, that's going to stop any exchange. It's a plug. It's going to stop longitudinal exchange. And I mean, again, should be true. How important and how persistent and how strong is the question. But if that's true, then over here we have a similar thing, which you call a thermal plug, or in the lakes they call it a thermal bar. So here we get a density gradient going that way. So warm water is going out and the cold water is coming in. And here we get a density gradient going other way. So again, you get two counter-rotating cells due to the density forcing. So you might have two like plugs or bars stopping exchange in estuary. I think it's that last bit I told you is just curious. I'm not sure that it's really that important, but it's fun to think about this. So that's really my story, but there's some questions and some implications of a lot of this. The first one is, can you have a quasi-steady exchange flow driven by evaporation or surface heating or cooling? So if you evaporate water out of Kuwait Bay and you make some dense water, can it flow out and other water coming in? Can you get rid of the fresh water quickly enough to actually drive a circulation like a classical estuary, but in inverse way? Or maybe it's not the evaporation, maybe it's the cooling. Or maybe not in Kuwait Bay, but maybe in the upwelling region, it's the heating. Can you do this fast enough to keep it moving? And I think the answer, there have been a few studies, we did some numerical modeling, which I couldn't get the graphic anyway, it doesn't matter too much. I think the answer is yes, if there's no vertical mixing, which doesn't happen in reality. It does happen maybe in deep places, like the mouth of the Gulf or the mouth of the Red Sea, or the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, where you can actually get dense water flowing out in a steady way. But in the shallow waters, there's too much mixing. So it's the density difference between the outflow and the inflow is too little that it's going to mix all the time and sort of stop that process from happening. So I think what happens, though, is that it builds up and then it releases itself as a pulse. So I'd expect that in our bays, and that's what we seem to see, and in Kuwait Bay, when it happens, there's going to be a pulse, like that cold winter shamal, cool the bay, and then maybe it has an outflow for a week, and then it probably stops, and then it has to build up again. So in San Diego Bay, we saw it as a very brief, just for a few hours as the slack tide happened. So here we have the mouth of San Diego Bay, where it meets the ocean, and the top panel is temperature. There are no labels on the isotherms, I apologize for that, but it's cold water, maybe 14 degrees, pushing in as a thermal wedge. But here at the back, you can see it going the other way. And when you look at salinity, it becomes clear why. The high salinity is coming out of the bottom, and you look at density, you can see, yes, the dense water is coming out of the bottom, driven by the hypersalinity. And here, the dense water is coming in, driven by the cold water. So you've actually got a thermal estuary in the outer San Diego Bay and an inverse estuary in the inner San Diego Bay. But if you came back maybe even just a few hours later, it would be gone, because then the tidal current comes in and mixes it all. Or maybe it'll happen or maybe it'll happen during the neap tides, when the tides are very weak, and the spring tides is going to mix it. In this case, it was just a few hours. So what will bring about these pulses and density-driven flow? It's either going to be a mixing cycle, like the tide or wind or something, or actually in upwelling systems, often it's ocean processes. If you upwell, you suddenly have cold water at the mouth, then suddenly there's a big gradient and you have an event. Or in Kuwait Bay, suddenly you have a cooling event, and then the hypersaline water will flush out. So this is sort of next steps of trying to understand how these happen. There have been some nice work in Shark Bay in Western Australia, where there's a very hypersaline lagoon, and that tends to drain out during the neap tides, and it builds up during the spring tide. There's too much mixing, and it sort of clogs it up, and then when the mixing weakens at the neap tide, then the hypersaline water comes out at depth. Okay, second question. So, can we expect the seawater that flows into these low inflow estuaries to be as useful as the river water that comes from land runoff? And yes, definitely in Tamales Bay we see this happening. And there is not so much an intrusion of the of the cold water, but it's just the tidal mixing. So right here that the seawater can be mixed in by the tides, and the upwelled water, of course, is very rich. It's full of nutrients. Sometimes it's full of plankton, and the nutrient flux into Tamalis Bay from the ocean is way bigger than from the river for most of the year. And so what we see is quite a nice result here. David Kimbrett in his PhD thesis, so this is the mouth of the bay, and there's again 20 kilometers, and the results here are chlorophyll values averaged over a few years. So there's quite a spread, but there's quite a nice clear maximum in the middle of the bay, whereas they're 10 kilometers, exactly halfway. So you often see high values, 8, 10, 12 kilometers of high chlorophyll, high phytoplankton concentration. And what's happening is, so these gray lines are giving a sense of nutrients, high nutrients at the mouth of the bay, and nutrients depleted at the back of the bay. And this other gray line is the residence time. There's not enough residence time in the outside of the bay. The water keeps getting flushed out by the tides, and there's lots of residence at the back of the bay, and in the middle is a sweet spot. There are nutrients, they haven't gone to zero, and there's residence time, it's not zero, and so that's where you get your algal blooms. So right it here, outer estuary is flushed by the tides, the inner estuary, the nutrients are depleted, and in the middle of the estuary is a sweet spot. And it is sweet because the oysters grow big and fat, and they really taste very good from that area. And so we see this also in Drake Sestero in California, and we seem to be seeing it in San Diego Bay, where there is, actually it's interesting there, because what we're seeing there is the outer bay, the CO2, PCO2 is, excuse me, is pretty low because of phytoplankton production. The back of the bay, the PCO2 is fairly low because of seagrass production. In the middle of the bay, the PCO2 is quite high because the respiration is not compensated by significant photosynthesis. So you actually get a longitudinal gradient in all of your related ocean acidification parameters. That work still, that's Alexander Karsh has still got to work it up. He's at San Diego State University. So both of what we're talking about there was just the tide mixing it in, but you do see times both in San Diego Bay and in Tamalis Bay where that cold water intrudes, and I already said it. This picture I've used before. This is a picture from a student thesis from a long time ago. Not the nicest contours, but you can see the cold water pushing into Tamalis Bay as a layer and into San Diego Bay. And both of the times this water is full of nitrate and whatever else. But the nitrate is important. And if it goes as a deep layer like that, you saw the temperature in Tamalis Bay, you saw the temperature getting cool the whole way into about over here and maybe even further. So it's injecting the nitrate a long way into the bay. Same thing with San Diego Bay. And we're getting results like this as well from San Francisco Bay. So then the nitrate lands up here, comes in as a layer, and eventually mixes up and probably can have an effect quite far into the bay. So I call these ocean-driven estuaries. That these are estuaries where the ocean is fueling, subsidizing, driving the system, the trophic system, perhaps the biogeochemistry as well, and more important than the river. So we're seeing this, I mentioned, in non-low inflow estuaries like San Francisco Bay. And in actual fact, a little bit of river flow helps pull the seawater in. So a little bit of river flow, if you go back to your classical circulation, will speed up the estuarine circulation. And in upwelling areas, the seawater coming in fast actually brings in more nutrients than the river water coming in slowly. It creates the stratification, more density forcing. And so my butterfly story, I like this, and it has to catch on a little bit. The two watersheds that make an estuary. So this is your estuary, San Francisco Bay. You have the watershed land runoff, but you also have a watershed coming from the ocean, the sea watershed, if you like. And in some systems, upwelling systems for sure, this watershed might actually be more important than that one. There's a lot of work to be done to show that and to show the balances and so on, but definitely a place like San Francisco during upwelling season In a dry year when there's not a lot of runoff, I think the bay is being driven by that upwell water coming in. And we definitely, it's a little more difficult to show the nitrate story because there's quite a lot of wastewater in the bay, but we've definitely seen times when the hypoxic upwelled waters going quite far into the bay, well beyond a tidal intrusion. And it happens when there is, of course, upwelling to give you the cold hypoxic water, but when there's a bit of river flow in the dry years, it doesn't work so much, and it happens during neap tide when the vertical mixing is weak. So we see these events. Are they important in, I mean, what I'm referring to is ocean water coming in, that is important, but this idea that it doesn't just come into the outer bay, but it can get injected quite far into the bay with all of its loading, not just nitrate, but also hypoxic, potentially low pH waters, etc. So this is ongoing work. If you move sort of out of a lot of these Californian estuaries are very narrow mouths. If you move to a more open estuary, if we think of Kuwait Bay as a low inflow estuary with the mouth being more open, then there are other processes, not just the tidal mixing, but the wind forcing, which of course is important here, and also the coastal flows. So this is from a different paper talking about bays like Monterey Bay and Table Bay or False Bay in South Africa, etc., that the bays can get forced by the winds, by the alongshore coastal flow, or by the density difference. And a lot of different bays on this set of axes. So there are multiple ways that a bay like Kuwait Bay could be flushed and exchanged with the Gulf. And it'd be, if anybody knows exactly how it works, please tell me. But otherwise, let's figure it out. So ultimately, that's the discussion now, later. Does any of this relate to Kuwait Bay or the Northern Gulf? I think I've talked a little bit about that. I guess I'm still a physical oceanographer at heart, although I'm trying to address environmental questions. And so for me, it's like what controls the exchange of water between the open Gulf and the enclosed bay? Why am I interested? Because it's important to bring material to the bay, but it's also important to export material from the bay. So it can be buoyancy driven by salinity or by temperature. Maybe you're forming dense water in the bay that comes out, or maybe there's a thermal estuary effect. I don't think so for Kuwait Bay. Well, actually it's not one or the other, perhaps at different times. The wind-driven circulation can make a difference, or what people sometimes call wind tides. If the wind, for example, in many places, I don't think it's so strong here as a sea breeze. The wind blows and then stops blowing and blows and stops blowing, and then you keep tilting the bay, almost you're making like a tidal effect. The tides themselves, not just the tidal diffusion like in Tamales Bay, but you can create a rectified tidal circulation in the bay. The remote forcing, I have no idea what the coastal trap waves are like in the Gulf, but there has to be some remote large-scale waves in the Gulf. And then the role of these internal waves and tides that Dr. Fahad is working on is, do they intrude into the Gulf, and are they important? So as I think about Kuwait Bay, I also find myself thinking about the nearshore ocean, because that's the other thing that I've been trying to work on. Let's say within maybe a kilometer of the shoreline, there's very, very little oceanography done, and the water can be quite different near to the shore than offshore. And most of the oceanography you have, and people even working in shallow and nearshore regions, are always referring to models or to satellite data or to in situ data, but it's hardly ever from where you're working within a few hundred meters of the shoreline, where the humans are living, where the coral reefs are, etc. So trying to understand what is controlling the exchange between that nearshore region, open coast, and offshore. So we've worked on, ideas in a shelf, coastal boundary layer, etc. But that's an ongoing question as well. And then finally, of course, does this exchange control, is it important to ecological biogeochemical processes, or maybe those processes are more dominated by biological and biogeochemical rates. So that's, I guess I'll just leave that up because those are the questions that I'm thinking about, and maybe somebody can answer them for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. John, for your talk, and we'll have a few questions. Let's start with Abdelhadi. Yes, please.
Hi, sorry, I do have a question. Usually we think when it comes to biology, we think about the migratory fish, and recruitment would be the movement of the fish themselves going inside or leaving the river or the estuary. But does that also has to do with the inverse and regular river in terms of density? Does that help the fish to recruit in the estuaries or not? And if it does, would the climate change would be affecting the seasonal timing of the recruitment of fish?
Yeah. See, you're asking, will the circulation and the exchange flows be important for the fish using the estuary as a nursery? My first answer would be probably no, and it's the habitat properties that, well, it's their behavior, I suppose, but that's based on the habitat properties that control that. But of course, if they're earlier life stage, then they will be much more subject to the exchange. So if they're actually swimming into the estuary to spawn or something, but on the other hand, if they're spawning in the Gulf and then typically the larvae and eggs get carried into the estuary, that would change with the circulation for sure. A place that definitely is important are those estuaries where the mouth closes, where the beach builds across it, and then, whether the water, I know in South Africa there are a number of fish species where the waves coming over that sandbar has to bring the larvae into the estuary, and they don't actually swim into it. Yeah, so it could make quite a difference.
So, Atani, questions?
I have a question. So there's a lot, the dams that are on the Tigris and the Euphrates
Right.
dictate a lot of the freshwater inputs.
Yeah.
Of course, there's very little. But if hypothetically they were removed, do you think you'd see more of a seasonal variation like you'd see in California and in some of those areas where there would be a normal estuarine process
Yeah,
and then hypersaline during the summer, possibly?
yeah, yeah.
I'm just curious as how that would affect the ocean or the water dynamics in the estuary.
Yeah, well, definitely in the, oh no, forgetting the name of the channel going up, coming down on the left side of Buoyancy Island. I mean, that would be like the Sulum or in Senegal or the Casamance or something, where in the wet season it would be low salinity, in the dry season it might go hypersaline. I bet you now if you went up that channel, you'd find it going up just like in the same exponential way like this. But Kuwait Bay is almost, it's quite interesting. It's almost like there's some estuaries like this in Washington State and also in Texas and so on, where the estuaries can be inverse, not because it's hypersaline, but because the Mississippi River plume comes past the mouth of it. So in the case of Kuwait Bay, when you would have had this strong river flow, in actual fact, the bay would be more salty than the Gulf, because the river's not coming through the bay. So you create an inverse circulation when that river came for a while. But then, of course, then you would have, once the fresh waters got into the bay, then probably you would revert to like a classical circulation for a while. So the river would have, it must be very important for the bay, because it would have turned into the bay. And some of the old writings I have found, they write about this. They don't show a lot of data, but it should turn with Coriolis into the bay and come through the bay. And presumably that's why there's a lot of mud deposit on the North Shore. But I'm just guessing now.
Would that cause one of those thermal bars or density bars?
Well, so I don't think the thermal bar is really important here, because you don't really have a lot of cold water.
Yeah.
I'll know how to see.
Yeah. I mean, it would be the hypersaline water that goes cold and drops out quickly. Then, yeah, it could create a more like the salt plug idea here, where you have the outer estuary going inverse and the inner estuary going classical. You could maybe, but it would, if you have one of those plumes coming through, there's a lot of energy going on, so I don't think it's going to actually lead to long residence times. I think everything's getting flushed pretty quickly then.
Question? So I have a question when you said about the salt sludge and the thermal sludge. So in between, like this is the dead zone.
Yeah.
In a way, like this is the area where contamination, fish kill. So
Yeah.
can we determine these locations and we classify it as a dead zone in a way?
Yeah, I mean, that would be interesting. So if you can, like in the schematic, you could take your boat and go along and look at the salinity and look at the temperature, and you could say, okay, we expect to have the flood here and here,
Yes.
and this place, the water should be sitting there for weeks.
Yes.
We can figure that out, and then what would be interesting is to go there and see if there's an effect of the retention, if it's truly being retained, because at the same time there's still some tide going on.
Yes.
And maybe the tide is actually dominating that buoyancy forcing. So I don't think anybody's shown yet that the water is really being retained so much that you will have, well, if you polluted that region enough, of course, you can have a problem. So it's all about how fast you put in the pollution, how fast the chemical reactions are compared to how quickly you flush out the water. But yeah, it'll be interesting to look at. I was wondering about now my geographical names are not so good, but the region just west of the city, and I'm not going to.
Referring to Kuwait Bay?
Yeah, Kuwait Bay, west of
southern
the city and south of the bridge. You know, where the one's creating a dead-end channel there, and that's maybe where you'd see some of these bars of retention. So
can you have like an estuary where you have two salt sludge?
yeah, I guess so. I mean, they would be in two different arms.
Two different arms.
Yeah. So like the place I mentioned, Drake's is sterile. It's interesting because it's like a hand. It's got almost 5 little arms, and each of them has got some retention in the back of them and a little algal bloom at the front of all of them.
Yes.
The desalination plants that are in the bay,
Yeah.
they have to contribute to these.
Yeah, you think so?
I'm sure. So it could be like Dr. Mohammed said, that there would be one at the mouth of the bay and one right at the back of the bay, and that keeps the middle very contained, or it would theoretically, correct?
Yeah, I think if if the bay looked more like the Marlow space, thin and long, you probably would see more of that. But because the bay is quite broad, I think there are other things going on. The desalination brine has to be important locally, but if you did a calculation of how much fresh water is getting taken out, we could do it quickly now, maybe if we weren't. How many million gallons per day going to desal versus how many million gallons a day going to evaporation. I think evaporation is way bigger for the bay as a whole. So I think it's mostly a local effect.
أسئلة بعد أحد عنده سؤال questions? Students. Tough questions.
Yeah.
Bonus.
Make it work. Yeah. Bonus points.
Graduates. Reem.
Okay, I think I have a question.
Okay.
What impacts can climate change or anthropogenic stressors like sewage discharge have on low inflow estuaries, given that low inflow estuaries are already hypersaline?
Yeah. The effect of climate change on this sort of process. I mean, well, the one thing I think we are seeing is in upwelling areas we've seen deoxygenation and more hypoxia, not from pollution but from upwelling and therefore, and then that hypoxia is getting imported into like San Francisco Bay, where oxygen is treated as a pollutant index. So it's interesting. So it's not just that it's happening, but now you get the regulation, and so the regulators want to say, you have to stop doing something because you're getting low oxygen, but it's not that person's problem. It's the climate change causing it. But on the physical side, there are changes in precipitation. So although we have some big events with some big river flow events, we have more drought. I mean, it's everywhere, I think. I know in South Africa and in California it's working like that. So you'll have these, you probably have these processes getting more strong most of the time, and suddenly you'll have a flood event. And then with temperature as well. If the, but it can go either way, because the bay, I think the bay is warming up more than the ocean in our area. So in actual fact, the thermal estuary gets stronger. But in other areas, the ocean might warm up and actually reduce that. So it is changing it, but in every place we really have to look at how it's changing it. Yes, bonus points. That was a good question.
She's graduated already.
Oh, but she can graduate again.
I think we're done here. So thank you, Dr. John, for this wonderful talk, and I hope I actually myself I learned like the sea watershed. I haven't heard of it before.
No, it's a new word.
It's a new word, and it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And thank you for the talk and all of this. Thank you, our guests. Dr. John, he has another talk in Shdadia, Faculty College of Science, Wednesday at 12:30, same time. I'm not sure but it's in the College of Science. There will be science. I think it's a theater there. So hope to see you there, and shukran, Dr. John. Shukran.
Thank you.